In July 1947, something came down outside Roswell, New Mexico. We've been arguing about what it was ever since, but this isn't a story about the crash. It's about what came after. Specifically, it's about a man named Earl Donahue, a ranch hand turned army auxiliary worker, who, in the days following the recovery operation, slipped a piece of recovered material into the lining of his work boot and walked it off the base. He kept it for 40 years. He kept it in his home. And according to everyone who knew him, his home was never quite the same after that. That's where this gets interesting. I want to start with the moment of contact because that's where everything else unravels. It was the third day of cleanup. That's the detail that gets lost in every major retelling of the Roswell incident, that there was a cleanup operation, not just a recovery operation. Those are two very different things. Recovery implies retrieval. Cleanup implies concealment. And Earl Donahue, by his own account, recorded on two separate occasions in 1987 and again in 1989 before his death in 1991, was part of the second team. The team that came in after the retrieval specialists had already done what they needed to do. The team that was handed rakes and canvas sacks and told in no uncertain terms to sweep the field until it looked like nothing had ever happened there. He was 23 years old. The field in question, a stretch of scrubland approximately 4 miles northeast of the main debris corridor on the Festa Ranch, was, according to Donahue, largely unremarkable by the time the cleanup crew arrived. Most of the larger pieces had already been removed. What remained were what he described as glinting things, small, almost imperceptible under direct sunlight, scattered across the caliche and the dry grass like someone had shattered a mirror that wasn't quite made of glass. He said they caught the light wrong. That phrase has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in his account. Not that they reflected light, not that they shimmered, but that they caught it wrong. As if the light that touched them went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. He picked up dozens of them over 2 days. He placed them in his canvas sack as instructed. But one piece approximately the size and shape of a large thumbnail, with a slight curve to it that he said reminded him of a fragment of eggshell. He did not put in the sack. He described holding it in his palm for what he believed was several minutes, standing in the middle of a field in the New Mexico heat, not moving. It felt like it was reading me, he told interviewer Thomas Calloway in the 1987 recording. Not warm, not cold, just aware. He put it in his boot. He walked it off the base. And here's the first question I want to ask, the one that seems almost too simple. Why that piece? Of the dozens he handled, of the potentially hundreds scattered across that field, why that one? Donahue himself said he didn't know. He said the decision didn't feel entirely like his own. That's easy to dismiss. That's the kind of thing you dismiss immediately if you want to keep a clean narrative. But I kept returning to it, because the piece he selected, the one that ended up in his home for 4 decades, turned out to be unlike anything material scientists who later examined it could readily classify. And that's where the story stops being about a theft and starts being about something considerably harder to explain. Earl Donahue brought the fragment to his home in Portales, New Mexico, a small agricultural town roughly 2 hours from the crash site, and placed it inside a tin tobacco box, which he put in the back of his bedroom closet. He told almost no one. His wife, Marguerite, knew. His youngest brother, Arthur, found out by accident in 1953 when he was looking for a pair of dress shoes, and discovered the box. That was it. For the better part of 4 decades, 2 people in the world knew that Earl Donahue had a piece of something he shouldn't have had. But the house knew. That sounds like the kind of line that belongs in a different kind of story. I'm aware of that. I'm asking you to suspend that instinct for a moment because what Marguerite Donahue described in a separate interview conducted by the same researcher in 1988 forms a pattern. And the pattern is what matters. The anomalies, as she catalogued them, began within weeks of the fragment's arrival. Small things at first. The bedroom where the closet was located developed what she described as an electrical feeling, particularly in the hours just after midnight. Not a sound, not a visible phenomenon. A feeling like the air in the room had a current to it. She told Calloway she initially assumed it was the wiring in the house, which was old even by 1947 standards. She had an electrician come out. He found nothing wrong. The clocks, she said, were next. There were 3 clocks in the Donahue home, a mantel clock in the living room, a wind-up alarm clock in the bedroom, and a wall-mounted kitchen clock purchased new in 1946. All 3, over the course of the first year, began losing time. Not randomly, not at different rates. All 3 lost time at the same rate, approximately 4 minutes per day. The mantel clock was mechanical. The alarm clock was mechanical. The kitchen clock was mechanical. All 3, despite different mechanisms, different ages, different manufacturers, synchronized themselves to the same anomaly. Marguerite brought this up with a local watchmaker in 1948. He inspected all 3 clocks and found, again, nothing mechanically wrong. He reportedly told her that synchronized drift between independently operating mechanisms was, in his words, not physically possible. She replaced all 3 clocks. The replacement clocks began losing the same 4 minutes. I want to stay here for a moment, because this is precisely the place where ordinary explanation strains past its breaking point. 4 minutes per day. Every clock in the house, across multiple replacement units for years. Not a power fluctuation, not a manufacturing defect, not a coincidence. The official explanation for something like this would invoke environmental interference, a strong localized electromagnetic field perhaps, or some peculiarity in the electrical grid serving that neighborhood. But here is the problem with that explanation. The neighbors' clocks were fine. Marguerite confirmed this. She asked. She was, by all accounts in the interviews, a methodical and observant woman. She asked 3 neighbouring households about their clocks. All reported keeping perfect time. The field, whatever was generating it, was contained to the Donahue property. And then there are the plants. Marguerite kept a kitchen garden, tomatoes, green chilies, squash, herbs, which she had maintained successfully for years before 1947. In the 2 growing seasons following the Fragment's arrival, her garden experienced what she described as wrong growth. The plants grew. They grew vigorously, in fact, but they grew in consistent directional lean, not toward the sun, as plants do, but toward the house, specifically toward the back bedroom. She documented this in a letter to her sister in Clovis, dated June 1949, which the researcher Calloway located and included in his unpublished manuscript. She wrote that the tomato plants looked like they were listening to something coming from the back wall. I went to Portalaise in 2019. The house still stands. A young family lives there now, and they were gracious enough to speak with me for a few minutes on their porch. They had no prior knowledge of the Donahue family or the Fragment, but the woman who answered the door without prompting, without context, before I had explained why I was there, mentioned that they'd had trouble with their clock since moving in. She laughed when she said it, like it was a quirk, like it was something you got used to. I didn't laugh. Earl Donahue finally showed the Fragment to someone outside the family in 1979, 32 years after taking it. The someone was a retired metallurgical engineer named Dr. Hector Salinas, whom Donahue met through a mutual acquaintance at a veterans gathering in Roswell of all places, and to whom he confided, after what Salinas later described as several hours of careful conversation, the existence and origin of the object. Salinas agreed to examine it. He was, by his own description in a brief written account found among his papers after his death in 2003, deeply sceptical. He was also meticulous. He spent 3 separate sessions with the Fragment, each conducted in his home laboratory in Albuquerque, before committing his observations to paper. The Fragment, he wrote, was approximately 2.3 centimeters at its widest point, with a slight concave curvature. Its surface appeared to be a single continuous material. No welds, no seams, no grain structure he could identify. It was extraordinarily lightweight relative to its apparent density. Salinus estimated its weight at a fraction of what a comparably sized piece of aluminum would register. Yet it did not behave like aluminum under examination. It did not respond to magnets. It did not respond to a jeweler's acid test. When he attempted to scratch its surface with a hardened steel tool, the kind that would mark titanium, it left no mark. None. He heated it with a butane torch. The surface did not change colour. It did not appear to conduct or absorb the heat in any way he could measure. He held it for the duration of the heat application with bare fingers because, and this is the detail that made me stop reading and start again, he didn't think to use tongs and he didn't need to. The fragment remained at ambient temperature while a torch was applied to its surface. He wrote, "I am not prepared to say what this object is. I am prepared to say what it is not. It is not any alloy or composite material I have encountered in 30 years of metallurgical work. It is not responding to any test I know how to administer in a manner consistent with known materials. I do not have a category for it." Salinus was not a sensationalist. He was not, by any account from colleagues and family, a man given to exaggeration. He had spent his career in industrial applications. He was, in the deepest sense, an empiricist. And the report he wrote, 4 pages of measured technical observations, ends not with a conclusion, but with a question. "What is this made of?" he wrote. "And why does it feel like it already knows I'm asking?" The fragment was returned to Earl Donahue. Salinus never published his findings. When asked by Callaway in a 1990 phone conversation why he hadn't, Salinus said only, "I didn't think anyone would be helped by knowing." That silence is impossible to ignore. What did he mean by that? Who would be helped? By what? The phrasing is so specific, so deliberate, that I've turned it over countless times in the years since reading the transcript. He didn't say he feared ridicule. He didn't say the evidence was insufficient. He said no one would be helped, as if the information was not merely controversial but dangerous in its implications. Earl Donahue came forward, if you can call it that, given the limited scope of his disclosures, in 1987. He was 63 years old. He had been carrying this for 4 decades. He chose to speak to Thomas Callaway, a private researcher operating entirely outside academic or governmental channels, through an introduction made by a mutual acquaintance in the UFO research community. The choice of Callaway is itself worth noting. Not a journalist, not a scientist, not a government investigator, a private individual, someone with no institutional affiliation to protect or compromise, someone who could lose nothing. Why 40 years? Why 1987? Donahue was asked this directly. His answer in the recording is halting. He takes a long time to respond. And then he says, "It started asking more. After a while, it started asking more." Callaway pressed him. "What does that mean, asking more?" "Things in the house," Donahue said. "More things, different things. I'm not a young man. I wanted someone to know before I couldn't tell them anymore." He did not elaborate. Callaway, to his credit or discredit depending on your perspective, did not push further on that point, so we are left with a severed thread. Things in the house, different things, more than the clocks, more than the plants, more than the electrical current in the bedroom. Something escalated. Something changed the frequency or character of the anomalies in the Donahue home in a way significant enough that a man who had guarded a secret for 40 years decided that guarding it alone was no longer something he was willing to do. What changed? When did it change? What exactly was it asking? The record doesn't say. And that gap, that precise, maddening gap, is where the pattern repeats with an almost mechanical precision. Every time the Donahue account approaches its most revealing moment, the documentation ends. The recording stops. The letter trails off. The witness declines to continue. As if the information itself has a perimeter and everyone who has gotten close to it has, at exactly the same distance, turned back. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And once you recognize it, You cannot look at the account the same way. The deeper you go into this account, the more a specific and uncomfortable idea begins to take shape. Not that the fragment was merely inert material from an extraterrestrial craft, a shard of hull plating, say, or a structural component, but that it may have been something functionally distinct, something that was not passive. Consider what we know. The material responded to no known test. It did not conduct heat, did not register mass consistent with its apparent density, left no surface marks under tools that would scratch titanium. It felt, to multiple people who handled it, as if it was aware of contact. It appeared to generate or influence a localized field that affected mechanical timekeeping devices with mathematical precision. It oriented plant growth toward itself, and in the final years of Donahue's possession, according to his own fragmented testimony, it changed behavior. This raises a critical and simple question. If the fragment was a passive piece of structural material, what would cause it to change behavior after 40 years? Passive objects do not change behavior. Passive objects do not have behavior. A piece of steel does not decide, 4 decades after being placed in a closet, to do something different. Whatever the fragment was made of, whatever it was designed for, and that word, designed, feels unavoidable by this point in the analysis. It appears to have been doing something the entire time it was in that house, and what it was doing was apparently cumulative. Dr. Salinas' oblique reference to no one being helped by knowing takes on a different resonance in this context, because if the fragment wasn't just a piece of debris but a component of some larger system, a monitoring device, a communication node, a power cell, a biological interface with technology that has no parallel in our engineering vocabulary, then the question of what it was doing in a bedroom closet in Portales, New Mexico, for 40 years becomes something genuinely troubling. Was it recording? Was it transmitting? Was it waiting for something? Was Earl Donahue's home for 40 years functioning as something other than just a home? I'm not making that claim. I want to be precise about that. I'm asking the question. And the distinction matters because asking the question honestly requires acknowledging that the evidence, partial, anecdotal, and frustratingly incomplete as it is, does not foreclose it. Earl Donahue died in December 1991. Heart failure. He was 67 years old. The fragment was not found among his belongings. Marguerite, who survived him by 11 years, told a researcher named Patricia Velez in a 2001 conversation, one of the last interviews she gave before her own death in 2002, that Earl had given it back sometime in the late 1980s. Given it back to whom? Marguerite would not say, or could not. Velez reported that the older woman became visibly distressed when pressed on the question and changed the subject with what Velez described as a kind of finality that told me the conversation was over. A woman in her late 70s, 4 years from death, still unwilling or unable to name where the object had gone. That tells you something. I'm not entirely certain what, but it tells you something. Thomas Callaway completed his manuscript, approximately 240 pages, according to colleagues who read early drafts, sometime around 1994. It was never published. Callaway declined multiple requests from researchers to make it available, citing concerns he described in a 1997 letter as not entirely my own to resolve. He died in 2009. The manuscript's current location is unknown. His family says they never found it among his papers. Not misplaced, not archived, not in the hands of a colleague or a university library or a research institution. Gone. The 1987 and 1989 audio recordings of Donahue's interviews survive. Copies exist in the collections of at least 3 independent researchers, and I have heard them, but they are partial. The 1989 recording in particular appears to have been edited, not crudely, not obviously, but Callaway's questions and Donahue's answers have a cadence that occasionally misfires, a rhythm that skips in the way audio skips when sections have been removed and the remaining pieces joined. One researcher who analysed the recordings at my request, a sound engineer with no prior interest in the subject matter, identified at least 6 points in the 1989 session where, in his professional assessment, material appeared to be missing. 6 points in a single recording, each one based on the conversational context immediately before and after, occurring precisely at moments when the discussion was turning toward the question of what the fragment was doing in the house, not why Donahue took it, not what it looked like, not what Salinas found. The excisions, if that's what they are, occur specifically when the conversation moves toward mechanism, toward function, toward what it was doing. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Every avenue of this inquiry that leads toward that specific question, not what it was, not where it came from, not who the beings that piloted whatever arrived over Roswell in July 1947 were, but what that fragment was doing for 40 years inside a human dwelling. That avenue closes. The document disappears. The witness becomes unavailable. The recording skips. Once you see that, the outline of something much larger begins to take shape in the negative space. I've been sitting with this material for years now, long enough that the questions have started to feel less like research and more like something I can't put down. The way you can't put down a thought that arrives at 3 a.m. and refuses to resolve itself into either truth or nonsense. What did Earl Donahue take from that field? Not in legal or ethical terms, those questions feel almost quaint now, but in the deepest, most literal sense of the word, what? What was it? What is the category of thing that resists every known material test, generates a mathematically consistent field effect on mechanical devices, orients biological growth toward itself, and after 40 years apparently changes its behaviour? What knowledge exists, or existed, about that category of thing? Was it ever written down, ever formally studied, ever understood by any human institution, official or otherwise? And if it was, where did that understanding go? Who holds it? Who decided that the rest of us shouldn't? What did the beings who built that object, and someone or something built it, that much seems impossible to argue against, intend for it to do? Was the fragment a component of something larger, separated from its system by whatever happened in the skies over New Mexico in the summer of 1947? Or was it, and this is the question I find most difficult to set aside, was it doing exactly what it was designed to do, in a home, over decades, with a family inside? If the fragment was transmitting something, information, signals, biological data, something we don't have a word for, where did that transmission go? Is it still going? Is the object, wherever it is now, wherever Donahue gave it back in the late 1980s, still active, still accumulating whatever it was accumulating in that bedroom in Portales? And what about all the others? Because this is the assumption that haunts me most. The assumption that Earl Donahue was unique, that he was the only cleanup worker who pocketed something, that across the entire debris field, across multiple days of operation, across all the hands that touched all those glinting pieces of material that caught the light wrong, only one person slipped something into a boot and walked away. Is that likely? Is that the most probable version of events? Or is it more likely that there are other houses, other closets, other families who learned to live with clocks that lost 4 minutes every day, and plants that leaned toward the wall, and a feeling in the bedroom just after midnight, like the air had a current in it? Other decades of quiet anomaly, unreported, unexplained, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't heard of Earl Donahue, and a tin tobacco box and a piece of something that felt, in a man's palm, in a field in New Mexico 79 years ago, like it was already reading him. We may have scattered the evidence of their technology across 100 American homes and called the effects coincidence. We may have built our ordinary lives around objects that were never ordinary. We may have been, in the most intimate possible sense, in our bedrooms, our kitchens, among our clocks and our gardens, in a contact that never ended. And the most unsettling thought of all, the one I keep returning to long after I've closed every notebook and switched off every recording. What if the beings who sent it knew that too? What if the crash wasn't the contact? What if we were?